All right, everybody. Welcome to another edition of FAMM's Heart to Heart series. I am Greg Newbern. I'm FAMM's Florida director, and we are thrilled to be together here today to talk a little bit about election 2020. I'm here with my wonderful colleague Celeste over in Pennsylvania. And again, today we're going to talk a little bit about the election and the criminal justice system. Many of you already know our guest today. He is the founder and editorial director of the Appeal Political Report. And if that's not intimidating enough, he's got a PhD from the University of Chicago. He created this indispensable 2020 election guide to all things criminal justice this year and tracked 465 items, everything from statewide ballot initiatives to county sheriff's races. And we're going to ask him to go through each one of those things in detail today. I'm just kidding. We won't do that. But I read every word he writes. I read every tweet he posts. I learn something from him every day. We are thrilled to have him join us today. Please, everybody, welcome Daniel Nishanian. Welcome, Daniel.
It's great to be here. Thanks for the introduction.
So we're going to ask you some questions. I'm sure Celeste will as well. But again, we wanted to discuss just what this election means for people who care about criminal justice reform. So I'll just ask, if you're someone who cares about criminal justice reform, how should we think about what happened last week? How should we think about the 2020 election?
Right. So the 2020 elections really unfolded in the backdrop of the protests over the summer, of President Trump's attempt to tie the election results to his law and order messaging. And there's a bunch of different levels of government, levels of elections, and the analysis could be different, depending on where you're looking. Obviously, the presidential level, the federal level, we all know the results, and perhaps we can talk more about what that means during the hour. But what I think is particularly important immediately to just start with is to just remind everyone that the local level, the county level, the state level, especially on criminal justice, is just so important, because that's really where both the states, both the laws are written that are going to be enforced and that lead to incarceration, and where prosecutors are elected, and prosecutors play such a big role when it comes to fueling incarceration, to coming up with more or less punitive policies, and that's really where a lot of the action was. And there's a bunch of different ways to think about that. One is there was a continued success by criminal justice reform candidates at the DA level. That's something we have seen with increasing pace over the past few years. Places like Philly, places like San Francisco, in past years elected kind of emblematic prosecutors who ran on this idea of decreasing incarceration as a central theme in the prosecutor's race, which is really what's interesting about the politics that are changing there. And we saw more of that this year, and we saw successes by candidates who ran on that platform. I'm not going to necessarily go deep in the weed immediately, but obviously we can talk about that. And what's also interesting isn't just successes by such candidates, it's also the changing conversations around what it is that local candidates are even promising to do. If you compared some of the platforms in 2020 to what made the most buzz in 2018 to what made the most buzz in 2016, you clearly see just much more ease in many more places by candidates that are putting in place, that are running on more clear platforms of what it is that they're going to do, and that's also a change. So I think there's kind of a curve here where a lot of people who are hoping for big change are maybe disappointed by the results at the level of Congress, in the U.S. Senate, U.S. House, but at the county level, at the local level, there's so much change, so much upheaval, both at the level of organizing that happened all year, and last week at the level of the results.
Daniel, how long have you been monitoring elections through the lens of criminal justice reform?
Yeah, Well, I started at the appeal, and specifically creating the political report as a platform to follow the local elections on criminal justice in the summer of 2018. So it's been two years and a half almost, but more importantly, it's been 3 cycles of elections, because 2019 had a lot of elections that were very interesting, which gives an opportunity to just really start to map out the landscape of the country. At this point, almost every jurisdiction has had at least some election in that period, kind of track some of the conversations that are changing. Also see what's very interesting, that some people are starting in some places to be inspired by what has happened elsewhere in the country, which is really the most interesting thing, I think, because when you think of the local level, it's so easy to lose sight, right, of what's happening around the country. If you're sitting in a county in New Mexico or Texas or even New York or San Francisco, whatever, you are used to the kind of conversations around you. You might lose sight of the debates that are happening in Boston or elsewhere in the country, and some of the more bold reforms that are being implemented there. But once those kind of the very broken down and the decentralized mosaic of elections, of reforms, of offices kind of comes into the view of a national platform, which is what we're trying to build. The appeal political report, it kind of changes the conversation everywhere, and that's really, I think, what we saw in 2020 as well.
So we've got people watching from all over the country here. We've got people down in Texas and South Carolina. Looks like up in Washington State, here where I live, and Florida, and of course where Celeste holds it down in Pennsylvania. So you've got a couple of cycles now. I don't know if you've had the opportunity to really dive into the 2020 results and the 2020 data. Have you seen anything from this election that would create some sort of trend line from the previous cycles, or anything that's broken from previous cycles? How would you interpret this election in light of the ones you've seen previously?
Right. So I think some of the things, I think what we're seeing really is, so, it's been, as we all know, who probably anyone who watches this is well aware of the 30, 40-year expectation that the politics of criminal justice are going to really favor tough on crime messaging, law and order messaging, understood as this idea of ramping up sentencing, ramping up charges, etc. And we live in the shadow of a lot of elections in the 80s and 90s that emblematically were won on such messaging, and I think that expectation remains to this day, just that that's what it means to win an election. I think when the first candidates began winning a few years ago, not just for DA, but also for other elections, for state lawmakers, all sorts of elections, judges, on a different message, it maybe was a bit surprising, and people were very cautious. I think after now years of that sort of messaging winning elections, and again in 2020, I think it's clear that it's not just empowered candidates, civil rights attorneys, defenders, public defenders who want to run for these offices to really do so on a sort of message that they really think would transform the country. It's also pressured incumbents and candidates who don't have that sort of views, that sort of priorities, to change at least their messaging. And that's why I think it's very interesting in 2020, even more so than in past cycles. We are seeing kind of everyone who's running in a competitive election, not everyone, we're seeing many more people who are running in these elections talk about reform, talk about alternatives to incarceration, talk about bail, talk about bail reform. Then the question becomes: are they actually doing anything about it? What it is that they're proposing to do? What is it that they've done? What is it that they're going to do? That's obviously a huge question. But the mere fact that those conversations are changing that in places like Maricopa County, even, or in a lot of the county in New Orleans, a lot of candidates are trying to look sympathetic to reform, no matter their concrete policy details. Maybe that's just a sea change in the expectations of what wins these elections, and also who wins these elections. We are still seeing new type of people, civil rights attorneys, people who have defended immigrants, people who have been themselves activists. We're seeing them win elections for judges and DA, and that's also just very new in terms of changing the conversation.
So to that point, for a long time, as you mentioned, it was assumed that if a candidate was not overtly tough on crime, or at least perceived to be overtly tough on crime, that was a political loser. It's become an article of faith, I think, at least among the reform community in the last few years, that we have shifted the tide away from that, such that one can be a reformer and not be afraid of losing a seat. But I don't know if at least so far we've seen evidence that people might lose seats for not being pro-reform enough. Have you seen any data to suggest, and perhaps it is reflected in the fact that people are running on these things, but have you seen any data to suggest that there might be a perceived political cost, not just not a benefit, but a cost to not being overtly pro-reform? If so, where do you see that, and where does that reflect?
Right. It's a great nuance, and it's important. And what I was saying in my previous question was, and it's fascinating. I mean, if we have seen these elections or these campaigns or followed them for a long time, it's just very fascinating to watch what you're just asking. Elections where candidates are for DA, let alone other offices, are running on who is more reform-minded. And so some place that immediately comes to mind this year is Austin in Texas, where an incumbent DA was running, and she, Margaret Moore, and she positioned herself as reform-minded. She touted her changes to policy, for instance, on how to handle lower-level drug offenses, and a few and some policies, and really that's Austin. And she lost this year to a progressive candidate who was a former public defender, and himself an advocate in Austin, who ran pretty much saying that the incumbent was just not reform-minded enough, was still putting too many people in the criminal legal system, including in the areas like drug offenses, on which the incumbent was touting some of her changes. So Jose Garza, who won the Austin DA race, and maybe we can talk more about Austin, for instance, ran on not prosecuting drug possession and drug sales of under 1 gram at all. And that was his position. So the debate there was very much on how far to take changes, rather than the type of conversation we might be more used to, which is reform versus tough on crime versus more incarceration, that sort of debate. And we saw some of that places like Orlando, places like Corpus Christi, so more of that sort of conversation in ways that were won by reformers as well. But places like Austin, and I'm sure others that will come to mind in a minute, it was more reform versus go further in the decarceration and decriminalization.
So Daniel, I also have a question for you. I mean, there's so much focus on the presidential election, but as you keep mentioning, the local races, the state races, that's really what matters with criminal justice reform on an individual basis every single day. So I want to know what you think across the country were some of the biggest wins on more of a local level, like you're saying with DA, with sheriffs and judges, that will really make a difference in how people look at incarceration.
Yeah, I mean, immediately, I was talking about the race in Austin, Texas, which is Travis County. So let me start there again, because Travis County is a very, very large county, but also it's going to perhaps be a very interesting, because in the state of Texas, we've seen some reform-minded candidates win, but Jose Garza would definitely take the conversation further than we've seen. And he also says he will. He also says he wants to speak up at the state level. Now, a Democratic DA in Austin speaking up at the state level in Texas might not necessarily move the ball forward, but criminal justice reformers have had allies among Republicans in Texas, which have allowed some bills to move forward. So that's going to be an interesting conversation in Austin, and specifically on the questions related to the war on drugs. Jose Garza seems to be willing to go further than other DAs have gone around the country. So that's going to be something very interesting to watch in Austin. The biggest DA race, clearly has to be LA. Because, first of all, just because it's a huge county. It has about 10 million people. And it's also known as a place that hasn't been very friendly to reform. It's also known as a place with jails that are very, very large, that have very bad conditions, and where the death penalty is still being fueled, and all sorts of issues in LA, where there's problems with law, with the LAPD, with the sheriff's office. And there, the incumbent DA lost last week to a progressive challenger, George Gascon, who actually is the former DA of San Francisco, who ran against the incumbent in LA and won last week. And that election really was as a very clear debate about what criminal justice should look like, what the criminal legal system should look like. George Gascon came in saying the incarceration rate in LA is four times higher than the incarceration rate in San Francisco. That cannot stand. That has to change. And so very clearly articulated as a goal a reduction in prison admissions and the reduction in the incarceration rate. That's a clear. I think I can't remember whether he gave a more specific goal of what that would look like, but it's just the measurement of the comparison San Francisco and LA, and coming in with that goal just gives you a clear metric by which to measure him, right? Specifically, his intention of lowering the criminalization of certain behaviors associated with poverty or homelessness, and not just that, also championing reforms at the state level. So LA really is kind of the defining election in that sense. And instead of just going through other DA races here, I will also just kind of mention that sheriff's elections are very important. We don't necessarily think about them as much as DA races, but sheriffs control a huge amount. They run jails. They decide how much to cooperate with ICE and other issues. And there we also saw a lot of a change. So I want to mention the elections in Georgia. Georgia is on everyone's mind this week just because of the federal results. But in Cobb and Gwinnett County, which are very large counties in the Atlanta suburbs, Democrats took over two sheriff's offices that were known for a long time as being very close allies of ICE. And the jails there had very big problems, a string of jail deaths. And both Democrats ran both on curtailing ties with ICE and on changing jail conditions and addressing the lack of accountability for jail death. So those results are also just to give you an idea that there's like all sorts of different offices. Like I could go on, judges, etc., school boards, and maybe we can. But just there's stuff happening all over the country and changes in these conversations.
I mentioned in the introduction that your election guide had 465 items on it. How did you find 465 items to follow? What was the process that you used to find nearly 500 criminal justice items to track for this election?
You make me sound obsessive here, which I guess I am.
We're all obsessive,
right? I should say I had a couple of guides. The guide that had almost 500 items was more broad than criminal justice. It had a lot. It was so I had guides on DA elections, ICE elections, criminal justice elections, and many of the elections on the 500 guide are criminal justice related. But that was also had a lot of elections for state houses, state senates, referendums that had to do with labor rights, education, all sorts of things. Obviously, it's actually I will say. First, that the same challenge exists on all sorts of issues of how when there's so much policy being decided at the local and state level that matter to the federal conversation, to the national conversation, and to why we care about politics, elections, policy. It's hard to keep an eye on everything if you care about it from a kind of a national perspective. And so the same idea kind of is there of creating these platforms, resources to follow more easily and understand what's going on. And also, of course, a lot of, I don't want to funnel criminal justice as its own thing. Things like access to healthcare, things like funding for education, things like the amount of the minimum wage, which are items that I was looking at there, are important, obviously, to what the shape of the criminal legal system is going to be, and to the availability of funding and public services that are gonna kind of counter the attention paid to the criminal legal system. And as to how, there's the places like Ballotpedia or the illegal selections or Twitter provide a lot of resources. A lot of people get very excited by tracking this local stuff, and the rest of it is my own OCD-ness.
Now, when you hit 465, were you like, that's it? Or was there a 466 where you're like, this is not important enough, that's all?
No, it's always growing. I mean, I've added some stuff since the elections that I had missed, that I feel annoyed at having missed prior to the election, as to what their importance was. I don't have anything in mind right now as to what that may have been, but yeah.
So it seems when you read the criminal justice part of your guide, you had DA races that we've talked about, you had sheriff's races, judges races, these sorts of things. A big one was ballot initiatives.
Right.
Can you talk a little bit about, well, let me just ask, what did you think was the most important ballot initiative in this election?
Well, in terms of theme, the ballot initiatives that kind of worked together and had maybe the most defining storyline of the election were initiatives related to the war on drugs and to curtailing the war on drugs. And every ballot initiative I had on my list that I was looking at that had to do with that passed, and often very easily. Frankly, I was surprised at how easily even the ones that I thought were more on the fence ended up passing. So 4 states legalized marijuana, including Arizona and New Jersey, as well as 2 states that went for President Trump in South Dakota and Montana, and all of them quite comfortably, even the redder states. And Oregon may actually be the most interesting, because what Oregon did is it passed what's called Measure 110, which is a measure that is going to decriminalize drug possession writ large. So not just marijuana possession, but also lower level possessions of other drugs. It's not a legalization initiative. Law enforcement can still enforce drug possession as illegal through a system of infractions, which is going to be important to look at, because we know that law enforcement, certainly even at the level of infractions, is very unequal and racially skewed as well. But that's a very important initiative, just because it's the first state that has done that. It's the first state that has decriminalized drug possession, and it's going to be very interesting to see how that affects the conversation elsewhere in the country. Whether other states look at Oregon, where I don't have the exact margin in mind, but it was, again, a very comfortable win, perhaps a more comfortable win than I anticipated. So it's going to be interesting to see whether that creates waves of conversation elsewhere, if not of actual change. So those are the ones that are most interesting in terms of resetting perhaps the conversation around the war on drugs, accompanied by other results at the county level. I was mentioning a DA race like in Austin, which was really fought in part on the harm caused by the war on drugs. And kind of, if you take it all together, it's clear that there's that there is some change being demanded by voters in how those in how substance use is being addressed.
I have a quick question about voter disenfranchisement on the ballot this year. And so could you just let us know kind of how that fared and how that could have even changed some of the outcomes of the elections this year?
Yeah, important question. And, I even could have mentioned it earlier, just because we're speaking about elections in the context of the criminal legal system conversation. So we immediately should acknowledge that millions of American citizens are not allowed to vote, right? Because of a past felony conviction. That is in almost every state true if they are in prison for a felony conviction. In many states, it's true if they're not in prison, whether in some places they're serving probation and parole or beyond. So again, that's millions of people who were not able to weigh in on these conversations that affect them, right? We're talking about criminal justice, DA elections, that is directly affecting who it is that is barred from voting. If a DA chooses to file charges at the felony level or the level of a misdemeanor, which we know is a decision that is racially skewed, racially biased. Studies show that certainly that is going to have an effect on who is allowed to vote and who gets to weigh in these elections. So that's the So that's an important thing to think about. In Florida, especially, obviously that was a big part of the story because Floridians in 2018 expanded the right to vote for 1.5 million Floridians who had completed their sentence, and then the Republicans in Florida adopted a law in May of 2019 that required the repayment of fines and fees as a condition of getting the right to vote. And so many people re-lost the right to vote. In fact, many people who had registered to vote in the time between the referendum and the law lost the right to vote, and some of them had voted in elections locally. And so that also weighs heavily on this election. The flip side is that a lot of states actually expanded the right to vote in the past couple of years. Places like Colorado, Nevada, and New Jersey expanded the right to vote. And this was the first general election where people who newly gained the right to vote were able to cast a ballot. So that's also important to think about. They've been videos that you can find on social media, articles that give voice to some of the people who regained the right to vote and how important it is for them to be able to cast a ballot. And Washington, D.C., this was the first election, actually, where Washington, D.C. over the summer, this is a huge step. In Washington, D.C. Allowed people in prison with felony convictions to vote as well. So Washington, D.C. joined Maine and Vermont as the only places in the U.S. that do not strip anymore anyone of the right to vote because of the criminal legal system, which is a very big development. And this was the first election where people in federal prisons from D.C. were able to cast a ballot. And so all of this kind of came to a head, to answer your question, in California, which had a ballot initiative, which is called Prop 17 on the ballot, which allowed people on parole to vote. So it effectively makes anyone who is not in prison for a felony conviction able to vote. And that ballot initiative passed by a huge margin, about 20 points in California. So going forward in future elections, that's going to allow many more people to vote. And a lot of the groups in California who worked on that, groups like Initiate, justice have vowed to continue pressing for change in California, including enabling people who are incarcerated to regain the right to vote in the future.
Daniel, obviously you're a reporter, but you obviously have a viewpoint as well. I want to ask you to set aside your biases for a moment. You mentioned that voters in a couple of counties in Georgia had elected reform-minded sheriffs, and obviously all of the world's eyes are on Georgia right now. Two very important U.S. Senate races in Georgia. Again, set aside your bias. If you were purely a political operative and you were trying to tell a U.S. Senate candidate in Georgia the best way to maximize his or her chance of winning this election, what approach would you suggest they take vis-a-vis criminal justice between now and January?
That's so. I think so. The counties I mentioned, let's start there, were Cobb and Gwinnett counties. And the reason Cobb and Gwinnett counties are very, very interesting is that they're, first of all, very, very, very large, about 1.5 million between the two of them. And they're known as historically conservative counties. That's where Newt Gingrich is from, for instance. So there have been a number of changes there. One, it's become much less white in the past 20 years, both Cobb and Gwinnett. And then the reaction to President Trump in suburban counties like Cobb and Gwinnett helped fuel Democratic wins in those places, not just in the sheriff's races, but also the DA elections were won by Democrats in elections that I didn't follow quite as closely, so I don't have much to say. But what's interesting, I think, is that it is not obvious. Like it seems obvious that it seems obvious to some people that gains by Democrats might mean gains for criminal justice reform or for some of the issues we're discussing. That's just not historically obvious at all, though. Like it is not historically obvious at all that partisan shifts towards the Democratic Party or places that vote more clearly Democratic are going to have officials at the county and municipal level that are friendlier to the goal of shrinking incarceration or shrinking the criminal legal system. That is not obvious. A lot of the prosecutors and sheriffs who have had a much more punitive approach. I'm thinking of people like David Clark in Wisconsin, or the DA in New Orleans who's retiring, have been Democrats in Democratic cities. So the fact that there's a shift, the fact that the shift towards Democrats in places like Cobb and Gwinnett is being accompanied not just by gains by Democrats writ large, but specifically by candidates who ran on things like curtailing ICE cooperation, addressing jail death, and advancing reform. That's really a credit to a lot of the work and organizing that's happened in places like Cobb and Gwinnett by immigrant rights groups, by reform groups, by the attention paid to carceral spaces, to the role of DAs, the role of sheriffs, by some by BLM groups over the summer and other or organizing associations to really press the candidates who are running to take clearer positions on what they will do to change to change the system. I don't know if I have a particularly good advice or particularly formed advice to give to people who are running for Senate elections. In part because my general modus operandi is to not pay that much to try and speak of other things than Senate races, because everyone kind of gravitates there. But I do want to flag that the types of wins we're talking about in places like Cobb and Gwinnett that are driving Democratic progress have been accompanied by a lot of work organizing to make the candidates take the positions that they have, and that potentially, there's been a change in the policy conversation and what people perceive as important as much as a change in the partisan shift in those places.
So I also want to ask a little bit about the biggest losses that we saw across the country for criminal justice reform. We've really been focusing a lot on the wins, which is nice, but at the same time, we do have to face the fact that sometimes our issues are not going to win. And so I'd love to hear a little bit more about the biggest losses that we saw.
Yeah, of course. There were a lot of shifts, a lot of flips for people who are in favor of more reform-minded approaches, and also some reform losses. So maybe let's start at the level of ballot initiatives, where overall, maybe more so than at the county level, there just aren't that many losses. I didn't even mention everything that would count as a reform win, but there's a few others in California and in really counties around the country. Oklahoma is an interesting example where things went the other way, where there was a ballot initiative in Oklahoma whose number escapes me, that was a priority for reformers there to continue shrinking the size of the prison population in Oklahoma, because Oklahoma has one of the highest incarceration rates in the entire country. It's been a very punitive states, and there were some wins at the level of through ballot initiatives in recent years on lowering the sentencing practices for lower level offenses, and this new initiative was meant to build on those past victories and continue lowering the sentencing rules for some of the lower level offenses, and it failed this year. So that will be interesting to watch whether what lessons are drawn from that. I haven't gotten to dig too much into that. There have been a lot of success stories in Oklahoma in recent years, and so and a lot of it's a state with conservatives have taken the lead in a lot of reform conversations, because it's a very conservative state where Republicans govern at the state level. At the level of county elections, there definitely were some counties that were really at the forefront of the conversation this year, where the candidate that was more resistant to criminal justice reform won. So maybe the biggest example in Arizona is Maricopa County, which is a huge county of 4.5 million people. It's the biggest in Arizona, and there a new Republican incumbent who was appointed last year was running for re-election against a challenger who had promised to make very big cuts to incarceration and participate in changing the culture in Arizona, because Arizona reforms, there's been a lot of organizing in Arizona, but reform proposals have kind of kept stalling in the state Senate because of some lawmakers and prosecutors lobbying who were stalling that. And the incumbent prevailed by a very small margin in that election, but will be in office for the next 4 years. And there were some other elections in places like Cincinnati, in Ohio, and surely a few others that I'm blanking on, where reform candidates failed to take over the office. Also, same in sheriff's races, places and some sheriff's races in Florida and Texas that reform-minded candidates were hoping to take over did not go towards the reformers. But that's to be expected. One last thing, I think the biggest defeat at the systematic institutional level for elections for reformers is that people are still not running for most of these offices. There still is a humongous number of elections for sheriff and DA that are uncontested. I ran an analysis of the elections in Wisconsin this year, where about 90% of DA races were only had one candidate, typically the incumbent, including in the biggest counties in the state. It's very hard to have the conversations around the fact that DA offices could need change, might need different approaches, that the old way of doing things is not the only way of doing things. It's hard to have these conversations when elections are passing by for 4, 8, 12 years with no one there to kind of press that conversation. So I think the biggest defeat and the missed opportunities for reformers continue to come from the fact that no one is running in many of these counties.
So what are the biggest and most important races you think for people to get involved in? I feel like if people aren't running, right, and we know that these races like DA's office, sheriff, and judges are so important on the local level. For the next time that people are voting and people who do want to run, what are some great ways for people to get involved, but also for offices for people to run for? Like you said, people aren't challenging the incumbents. What is your advice to those people who might want to get involved?
Right. I mean, there's a lot of things happening. I mean, what I was talking about earlier, I think we have expectations of who it is that is going to be a DA that has been appended, right? When we see people who have not worked as prosecutors in the past, but in fact have challenged the system, whatever you think of the outsider dynamic, that changes expectations maybe elsewhere of who it is who's running. And we've seen that. We have seen people, I mean, when I've interviewed some DA candidates, they have said things like, I didn't necessarily think someone like me should be running for prosecutor, but when I see like Krasner run in Philly or some other people like that, why not me? And that's something that will be interesting to track. We saw that in Virginia last year as well, where there were some counties where prosecutor candidates were attacked for their past as in the Innocence Project or as the defense attorneys and won the elections against career prosecutors. So there's a change of expectations of who is even occupying these offices. There's also what's I think very exciting in terms of just covering this and the scope of what we're covering, that there's just many more type of offices that are entering the conversation. I think I myself over the past half hour have been guilty of really focusing on DAs because that's where a lot of my reporting has been, and that's where the questions took us. But we have seen other offices increasingly become part of more a comprehensive understanding of what to contest if you want to fight mass incarceration. So, for instance, there were elections for judges this year, judges at the level of criminal court, at the level of municipal courts in New Orleans and in Clark County, Nevada, which is Las Vegas, that were won by some people who ran on challenging mass incarceration, people who themselves have a background as public defender, and that's interesting to see that the judges' elections have sort of quasi slates of reform candidates winning. In school board elections this year, there were some places where candidates, as I already mentioned, I think, who were running on getting the police out of schools. They were running for school board on such a platform. They won in places like Prince George's County in Maryland, in the suburbs of DC. That's interesting, where the conversations we're having about the school to prison pipeline kind of entered a realm of school board races and actually helped shape the results. And I could go on. My favorite example of this year was that Vermont has an office called the High Bailiff, the Office of the High Bailiff, and which is a very overlooked office that doesn't have very clear powers. But a bunch of criminal justice reformers this year said, why wouldn't we run for high bailiffs? Because it's sort of connected to law enforcement. It sort of has an oversight role. It hasn't really been used for a very, 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 very long time. And they won offices as high bailiff. And when I talked to them, they themselves were like, we're not quite exactly sure what we're going to do with the office, but it does have an oversight role. So why not win these elections and start having these conversations with sheriffs, with law enforcement in Vermont, and see what it is that we can do with winning winning more of these local offices. So I think wherever people are, they should pay attention to what's up on the ballot in 2021, 2022, and sort of start getting creative, right, about what it is that these offices actually do, and what is it that people can run on and change through these offices.
We're getting some good questions from folks who are watching online, and I'm definitely going to get to them, and I guarantee people want me to ask them. I have one question before I get to those, though. So if you're like us, election night, you're just frantically refreshing the election results, looking at state house races and things like that. You're following hundreds of things across the country. What did you find yourself frantically refreshing to try to find the result, because you were watching that more closely than maybe something else?
Well, I'm not going to lie. I'm happy to talk up state and local elections, but on election night, I was watching the presidential race. I'm not going to pretend otherwise. I mean, for days, I think for days I was watching whether Georgia would flip blue at the presidential level. And that's what I was focusing on. I think the thing is, to actually answer your question, there's some elections that still aren't decided today, and probably the biggest that I have a tab open that I refresh every 20 minutes is the election for Chief Justice in North Carolina. That I would invite people. We actually ran an article on it in the Appeal. I would invite people to look it up if they're online right now, because the Chief Justice there, who's a Democrat, was being challenged by another justice who's a Republican, who gave up his seat to run for Chief Justice. It's a bit complicated, but the stakes, the contrast, the conversation really centered to a degree that's maybe not usual in Supreme Court elections, on questions of racial justice, on questions of civil rights, and on the question of how big a role should the courts play in advancing racial justice through their decisions. And the court in North Carolina has had a particularly important role in recent years in issuing important decisions on things that have to do with injustice, with racism, with the death penalty, with civil rights, and a bunch of related issues. At the moment, the race is within 800 votes out of 5 million, and there's some ballots left, and that's going to determine. Democrats are sure to keep the majority of the court, actually, but that race, just the willingness of the candidates to articulate a vision of racial justice that was not the same at all, it was very interesting.
That's fascinating, and something I certainly didn't know about. Thank you for sharing that. One of the questions we got from our viewers online is about the phenomenon of defense attorneys running for district attorney. Have you seen that, and have there been any what they would call success stories of people from a criminal defense background, public defender background, running successfully for a state attorney or district attorney position anywhere in the country?
Yes, they have been, and that's part of what I was alluding to earlier when I talked about a new understanding of who it is who's even running for these offices, right? So maybe the emblematic example, though not the first, was in San Francisco last year, where Chesabuddin, who's a former PD himself, ran for DA in San Francisco and won the election. And what's especially interesting is that in the course of that election, which was a year ago, so in 2019, he was attacked, or some of his opponents, when he was articulating goals that had to do with shrinking incarceration, so some of his opponents say that he should run for chief PD of San Francisco rather than DA, as though to say that concerns having to do with injustices in the criminal legal system, with the size of incarceration, with who we're sending to prison and why, as though to say that these questions should not be on the minds of prosecutors that that's not what prosecution is about. And Shazabuddin won last year, and some of the same dynamic this year in Austin, in Texas, as I was mentioning. I think there are some other people with a defense background who won this year, though now I'm blanking on them. But they've been, but that's been interesting to see, because the expectation of what professional experience people have is tied with the question of what the DA office is for, right? There's an expectation that the next DA, that's reigned for a long time, that the next DA should be the chief assistant to the DA. That when the DA retires, the chief assistant just becomes DA. And in many places, that is what happens. The chief assistant is still the only candidate who runs. In many places, there's a weird maneuver that happens where the DA will resign before an election, and the governor will appoint the chief assistant DA who then gets to run as an incumbent. I wrote an article on Oregon and that kind of practice. But the problem there is that it just is taking on the norms, right, of what we have understood the criminal legal system to be for the past 34 years. It just takes those norms and continues them, as opposed to rethinking what policy should be implemented, what norms should be changed, what culture should be changed, and just really understanding the range of policy options and possible transformations that can happen. So we're definitely seeing a trend of that.
And I just want to follow up with that, because I really think it's important that you bring up the San Francisco DA race, because DA Boudin is directly impacted. And when you're talking about changing what we think about when people run for these races, growing up with your parents in prison, that changes how you feel about the criminal justice system. And so I think it's really important, as you're saying, to kind of reframe how we think a prosecutor needs to look and needs to practice law.
Yeah, and there were other, for instance, in that vein, not in a DA race, but Washington State just elected its first formerly incarcerated candidate to the state Senate. That's also an interesting change in the perspectives that are going to be represented there in Washington State. The candidate Tara Simmons, who's formerly incarcerated, actually had to fight to be admitted to the bar and be allowed to take the bar exam, because the Washington, I think it was the board of the bar exam, tried to block her from taking the exam because of her criminal record. She won a court case on that. Then she ran for office and won. And I've talked to people in state senates and state assembly members and state senators who have pushed some reform policies and have failed, who have told me, it's very hard to get people who are impacted directly to testify, in part because people who are most impacted directly are in prison, and they're not being invited to speak. They're not being invited to speak when there's a hearing on the bills in the state senate or state assembly, especially when we think about practices like prison gerrymandering that further disenfranchise people who are impacted from impacting what's happening at the level of state politics. So there's definitely been a lot of changes that, I don't want to overstate. There's still cases here and there rather than like a giant wave of change on those things. But there's definitely at least a changed expectations, which could potentially lead to more candidates and more results like this in 2021 and 2022.
I also just want to highlight, to follow up on this question, in Philadelphia, we had DA Krasner, who was a defense attorney throughout his career and was elected as the district attorney here and completely changed the way that the office was run. We've seen a whole bunch of changes, and they've got a great data dashboard to show how those outcomes are looking. And so I think it's a really great trend, and I definitely hope to see more in the next election.
So we're streaming this on FAMM's YouTube channel, and we got a good question from somebody watching it on YouTube. And in fact, I think this is probably more a question for Celeste. And then I want to ask Daniel to follow up maybe more generally. But the question is, what can people do to get the sentencing laws changed in Pennsylvania? So Celeste, I know you know that better than anybody, but Daniel, if you could think about the same question just more broadly across the country, I'd appreciate you following up on that. But Celeste, you first.
Hey, I mean, funny somebody should ask about Pennsylvania. So yeah, if you want to get involved in changing the sentencing laws in Pennsylvania, text chances to 21333. We're really doing a lot of work here in Pennsylvania to do things like end life without parole, implement medical release and geriatric release. You know, we have a lot of people who filled out our criminal justice survey who actually won re-election. And our website is pajusticevoter.com. So if you are in Pennsylvania, you can go on pajusticevoter.com, put in your information, and they will actually pull up your representatives, see if they won and see if they filled out our survey. Accountability is key. One thing I think people don't really realize is that people who are elected to represent us in Harrisburg, which is our state capital, but in all kinds of capitals across the country, we pay their salaries and they work for us. So don't be afraid to actually call your representative, show up at your representative's door, make appointments to actually meet with them and let them know why these issues are really important to you as a taxpayer and as a voter, and make sure that they're actually following through on the campaign promises that they made. A lot of people ran on criminal justice reform this year, and we need to make sure that, you know, the end of this session and next session and the sessions coming up, that they're actually being held accountable for the things that they have set out to say that they're going to do. So really make sure you're getting involved in advocacy. You know, share actions, try to get your family members involved, show up to things if you can, if they're having different events. But really make sure that you're making your voice heard, because people who are elected at the state level, they're the ones who are making our sentencing laws. And if you're not happy with it, then let them know you're not happy with it and demand that they make a change. I'd love to hear what Daniel has to say about it too.
Yeah, I mean, you know, like there was a lot of talk during the presidential campaign of President Trump, who said things like, "We got criminal justice reform done," as though, you know, as Celeste was saying, nothing will get done until every state really at the state level is prioritizing this and really taking huge stabs at it. At the state level, the story of 2020 elections, when it comes to who controls state governments, it's really a status quo election, in that most parties just kept the chambers that they had. Very few flipped, especially the bigger states. And that, you know, so we are still going to be in the same kind of political dynamics in places like Arizona, Florida, and Texas as before. But certainly, I expect the reform bills to be introduced in all these places. What's interesting is that in some of the states that maybe have been more bold in criminal justice reform bills in the past couple of years. I'm thinking of places like Colorado, perhaps. Also, starting to maybe Virginia, where Democrats just took control last year. Those also didn't change. So Democrats didn't make gains in places like Arizona. Republicans didn't make gains in places like Colorado. So it will be very interesting, I think, to watch those states and see what new bills are introduced now with the hindsight of having won an election, having run on the progressive bills, for instance, that Colorado adopted in the past few years.
That was a great question from Karen Brookins. Thank you, Karen, for that.
Hey, Karen.
We're down to about a minute and a half left. I want to take every second of this while we have Daniel. We're so appreciative. If you could give us 30 seconds on what to expect in 2 years for criminal justice on the ballot, what do you think?
Well, I think it's not 2 years. I think it's 2021 is coming up, and 2021 has a lot of elections. There you go. So one reason we didn't talk that much about Pennsylvania today is that Pennsylvania has off-year elections when it comes to county level elections. So 2021, about half of the, I don't know no, I don't know the exact number, but about half of the counties in Pennsylvania will have DA elections and sheriff elections in Pennsylvania. So if you're in Pennsylvania, that's something that's going to be very interesting to follow. So some very, very big counties, including Philly, where Celeste mentioned Larry Krasner earlier. It's going to be his first re-election race, presumably, if he runs for a re-election. Also in Virginia and New York State, there's going to be a lot of interesting DA elections next year. The DA election in Manhattan is already shaping up to be like a battle royale of a lot of candidates who want to challenge the incumbent there on a platform of reform. A lot of candidates. I've lost count of how many they are. But I always like to push people to look beyond like places like New York City, San Francisco, and Philly, because a lot of the storylines this year, the past few years, have happened in places that aren't on the radar as much. Places like suburban areas like Colorado districts this year that elected reform candidates, suburban areas of Virginia last year, even rural areas like Colorado and Mississippi in recent years that have elected people who have run on this platform, and those are easier to miss. So I would invite people to look into some of the changes that are happening, not just kind of like at the top of the ballot or biggest counties, but in rural and suburban areas as well.
That's fantastic. Well, Daniel, we appreciate your time. This has been wonderfully informative. We know you'll be following all of these races. Where can people read your stuff? Where can they find you online?
Right. So you should always read the Appeal, which is where I work and does a lot of great coverage of criminal justice. Yeah, you could follow me on Twitter if you wanted at Taniel, Taniel with a T. And yeah, so come aboard because there's a lot happening in the coming years at the federal level and state and county levels.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for your time. I hope everybody learned as much as I did. We are thrilled that you joined us, and we hope to talk to you again, maybe later this year, to talk about these elections where they're important all over the country. So thank you for everybody watching. We'll be back next week with another Heart to Heart. Thank you, guys. We'll talk to you soon.
Thanks so much.